It moved more earth than the Panama Canal. It put 11,000 men to work in a place with almost nothing else to offer them. And on a quiet Thursday afternoon in September of 1938, a piece of it stood up, turned liquid, and swallowed 34 of those men whole. This is the story of the Fort Peck Dam, the largest pile of dirt ever assembled by human hands, raised across the Missouri River in the emptiest stretch of Montana anyone could find. It is a story about scale, tiny men beside machines the size of office buildings, machines beside a river that didn't care how big they were, and a hole in the ground so vast the only way to fill it was to build an army. We're going to find out how 10,000 unemployed men, equipped with steel dredges and walking draglines, tried to bury a river under 250 million tons of mud, and why, on one ordinary afternoon, the ground they'd built turned around and buried 8 of them instead. 6 of those men are still down there. They never came out. The dam holds them today, the same way it holds back the water. Picture the scale honestly. A man standing at the base of one of those dredges looked like a child standing next to a grain silo. A man standing on the slope where the draglines worked looked like a piece of gravel himself, lost against buckets that could swallow a pickup truck in a single bite. This wasn't America building something delicate. This was America trying to move a mountain by brute force, using thousands of men small enough to fit in the shadow of machines built to make the impossible feel routine, until the day the grind underneath all of it decided it wasn't going to cooperate anymore. It was a triumph. It put bread on 100,000 Depression-era tables. But it also nearly tore itself apart, and when it did, it didn't ask who was standing on it first. Here's the question that should bother you the whole way through this story. How do you build something safe out of a material you can't fully see into? Every other part of this dam, the engineers could measure, test, and pour with confidence. The one part they couldn't, the ground itself, buried under everything they built, turned out to be the only part that mattered. The hole they dug to stop a river. In 1933, the Missouri River near Fort Peck, Montana, was doing exactly what it had done for 10,000 years, flooding when it pleased, drying up when it didn't, and ignoring every town downstream that depended on it behaving otherwise. The river was the antagonist. Long before anyone poured a shovel of fill, it carried floods that drowned farmland from Montana clear down to St. Louis. It silted up so badly that steamboats ran aground a mile from where they were supposed to dock. And it sat in the middle of a country that in 1933 had nothing to lose and nowhere else to put 25% of its working men. So the federal government decided to build a wall across it. Not a wall of concrete. There wasn't enough concrete in Montana, and there wasn't time to pour it. A wall of dirt, 2 miles of it, corner to corner, more than half a mile thick at the base, stacked 250 feet into the sky. When the engineers from the Army Corps finished their math, the number that came back was something like 125 million cubic yards of earth and rock, enough to bury Central Park 3 stories deep. Enough that the project would require, in the words of the men who later studied it, the largest construction plant and workforce assembled in this country since they dug the Panama Canal. Could it be done at all? Nobody in 1933 had built anything quite this size out of mud. That was the antagonist hiding inside the first one. Not just the river, but the math. You don't pour an earthen dam like you pour concrete. You build it grain by grain. And if you get the grain wrong, the whole thing remembers. Before a single yard of fill went into place, the site had to be stripped bare. Clearing crews spent the better part of a year just scraping the dam's footprint down to stable ground, removing more than 4 million cubic yards of topsoil, brush, and loose alluvium before construction had even officially begun on paper. There was no rail line within reach, so crews built one, a spur running across the prairie from the main Great Northern Tracks at Wyoto, just to haul in the equipment that would eventually haul in the equipment. A bridge had to go up over the Milk River before trucks could even reach the site in any season but summer. The project was building the tools to build the tools long before it laid down a single dredge. That first year cost the project blood it never wrote up as drama. Men building the rail spur lost fingers to frozen couplings. Clearing crews worked through a January that hit 50 below, hauling brush by hand because no machine had arrived yet to do it for them, in cold that could turn exposed skin white in minutes. None of it made the newspapers already calling Fort Peck the New Deal's newest engineering marvel. The accomplishment and the toll arrived together. From the very first shovel, the engineers picked their weapon, hydraulic fill. Instead of trucking in dirt by the shovel load, they would dredge it, pump it as slurry, mud and water together, through pipelines, and let it settle into place by gravity, the coarse sand falling first along the outer shell, the fine clay drifting downhill to form a dense waterproof core in the middle. It was elegant on paper. It also meant building, from scratch, in the middle of nowhere, a fleet of dredges bigger than anything the upper Missouri had ever seen. There was no shipyard within 500 miles, so they built one. Workers nicknamed it the Fort Peck Navy, the biggest shipyard in Montana, built to make boats for a project that wasn't anywhere near an ocean. 34 vessels came off those ways before the work was done. 4 of them were dredges, each one packing more than 12,000 horsepower, each one capable of chewing through more material in a day than a small army of men with shovels could move in a month. That was the before and after the engineers had promised. What would have taken thousands of laborers years with picks and wheelbarrows 4 machines could do while most of the crew slept. Word got out fast. By July of 1936, more than 10,000 men were drawing a paycheck on the Fort Peck project, 11,000 at the peak by all counts. They came from dried-out wheat farms, from shuttered mines, from cities where there hadn't been honest work in years. Newspapers covered it like a circus coming to town, because in a way, it was. Nobody in northeastern Montana had ever seen anything like the equipment rolling off the rail cars. Cranes, draglines with buckets the size of a kitchen, tractors that could pull a house. The reaction wasn't fear. Not yet. It was something closer to disbelief. Men who'd never seen a building taller than a grain elevator were about to spend their workdays standing in the shadow of machines that dwarfed any building in the state. The first dredge hull splashed into the river in the summer of 1934. Nobody knew, watching that first hull slide off its blocks, whether the whole hydraulic fill idea would actually hold a quarter-mile of earth in place against the weight of a reservoir. The math said yes. The shale underneath the site said something else, but nobody was listening to the shale yet. The first dredging season would settle the argument one way or another. Sand dropped where it was supposed to drop. Clay drifted downhill and packed itself into a core dense enough to satisfy the inspectors running samples day after day. The embankment climbed. Crews who'd spent a year carrying brush and laying rail finally watched a dam rise out of the prairie. A few feet of fill at a time, and the sound of it, pumps, engines, men shouting over both, was relief as much as labor. It worked. That was the proof everyone needed before sinking 5 more years and 10,000 more men into the same method. They'd built the beast. Now came the harder part, feeding it, running it, and trusting a river of mud to settle into something solid enough to hold back a lake 200 feet deep. Because the project wasn't just a machine doing work, it was a machine doing work on top of ground nobody had fully tested. And ground, it turns out, keeps its own secrets. The machines that ate Montana? Here is how you build a mountain out of soup. 4 dredges, moored out in the borrow pits a few miles from the dam site, chewed into the riverbank around the clock during the dredging season. Spinning cutter heads broke the ground loose. Suction pipes pulled it up as slurry, a mix of sand, clay, and water thick as gravy. Pumps powerful enough to run a small city's worth of motors shoved that slurry through pipelines laid out along the crest of the rising embankment, where it was discharged in long, lazy sheets down the slope. Gravity did the sorting. The heavy sand dropped fast, building the outer shell. The fine clay rode the water further downhill before settling, forming what would become the dam's core, the dense, nearly impermeable wall hidden inside the embankment that was supposed to do the actual job of holding back the lake. Cut, pump, discharge, settle. That was the whole chain, simple to say, brutal to run 24 hours a day for 6 dredging seasons straight. But could the ground underneath carry 250 million tons without flinching? season after season? That was the question nobody could fully answer in 1933 because nobody had ever asked Montana's bedrock to carry a load like this before. Beneath the loose river sand and gravel at the site lay something called Bear Paw Shale, a thick, ancient seabed turned to stone, laced through with thin seams of a clay mineral called bentonite. Bentonite has a party trick. Add water and it swells and turns slick, almost like wet soap between two boards. Engineers knew the shale was there. What nobody on Earth knew yet, because nobody had built anything this heavy on top of it before, was how that bentonite would behave once it was carrying 250 feet of wet fill on its back. For years, with nowhere for the trapped water to go, underneath every other impossibility on this job, sat the real one. The isolation was real. The nearest rail line ran through nothing, and crews built their own spur just to get equipment to site. The weather was real. 54 degrees below zero in January, 115 in July, both recorded at the same patch of prairie. Pipelines froze solid most winters, which meant the entire dredging operation shut down for months at a time and had to be thawed and restarted from scratch every spring, a process that 8 weeks the schedule couldn't really spare. But underneath the isolation and the weather sat a foundation problem that no amount of horsepower could fix, because horsepower wasn't the issue. The issue was a layer of clay nobody could see, quietly deciding how much weight it was willing to hold. Above ground, the scale alone was enough to make a grown man feel like a child. The dam, when finished, would stretch 21,026 feet, almost 4 miles bank to bank. Its base would run 3,500 feet wide, more than half a mile of dirt just to get from the upstream toe to the downstream toe. Stand a man next to one of those 4 dredges and he disappears against the hull. Stand him next to the spillway gate towers going up 3 miles east of the dam, concrete piers climbing toward 16 vertical lift gates, each one 25 feet high and 40 feet wide, and a photographer named Margaret Bork White would later capture precisely that. 2 workers at the base of those towers, dwarfed so completely by concrete that they look less like builders and more like an afterthought. That photograph ran on the cover of the very first issue of Life magazine in November of 1936. It became, almost overnight, the picture America used to explain to itself what the machine age actually looked like. The cost matched the scale. The whole project was projected to run past $100 million, a staggering sum during the Depression, in a county that, before 1933, had barely had a bank. By the middle of 1938, the project had already burned through 47 million man-hours of labor, a number so large it stops meaning much except this. Somewhere on that prairie, every hour of every day for 5 straight years, dozens of men were standing in the mud doing something dangerous. None of that record-breaking output came free of risk to the men running it. A cutterhead operator who misjudged the swing of a boom could find himself in the water without warning. A deckhand walking a pipeline at night had only a lantern and his own balance keeping him off the edge. It was the kind of danger that never made the record books. Only the safety talks nobody outside the crew ever attended. And the chain reaction never stopped reaching further than anyone planned for. The spillway alone, that mile-long concrete channel 3 miles from the main dam, built to dump 250,000 cubic feet of water a second in an emergency, required gouging 14 million cubic yards of earth and shale out of the prairie, pouring 500,000 cubic yards of concrete, and bending 55 million pounds of steel into place. 4 diversion tunnels had to be cut straight through the same shale that worried the engineers, so the river would have somewhere to go while the dam rose around it. Crews used coal saws to slice into the rock, then blasted the loosened shale free and hauled it out by rail car. 3 shifts, 4,000 men, day and night, for months. The blasting never really stopped. Folks downriver in Glasgow and the surrounding camps got so used to the concussion rattling their windows that a local paper joked the concrete mixers roared like a den of angry lions. That joke had a second meaning nobody printed. The same shale those coal saws were cutting through, laced with the same bentonite seams running under the main dam, slid more than once during the tunnel work. Small slumps, contained quickly, written up as routine. Routine, that is, until the day it wasn't. For now, the machines were winning. 4 dredges working in relay could place more material in a single record day than entire mining operations moved in a season. The chain reaction the engineers had designed, cut, to pump, to discharge, to settle, was holding season after season, climbing the embankment higher every year. The gearing was brilliant, the dredge fleet was a marvel, but somewhere in the slope they were building, a weakness was already there, settling quietly into place right alongside the sand and the clay, and nobody knew yet where. We still haven't gotten to the afternoon the ground swallowed 34 men. We're getting there. First, you need to understand what it actually cost, every single day, just to keep this machine fed. Noise, and the wages of Wheeler. Run a machine that size for 6 years, and it will break you in ways no blueprint accounts for. The dredge pumps clogged on gravel too coarse to pass, and had to be cleared by hand, a man leaning into a housing that could take his arm off if the operator upstream didn't get the signal in time. Pipelines froze solid in the Montana winter and had to be thawed with steam lances before the CZ's dredging could even start. Cable on the draglines parted under load without warning, snapping back across the cut with enough force to kill a man standing in the wrong spot, and more than one did stand in the wrong spot before crews learned the hard way how far back to stay. These machines weren't run by engineers in clean shirts. Dragline operators were skilled men, prized and hard to replace. But the laborers, swarming around the base of every machine, greasing fittings, clearing jams, walking pipelines looking for leaks, needed no experience beyond a strong back and a willingness to show up. A crew of a few dozen men could keep one dredge running through a shift. Multiply that across 4 dredges, the tunnel gangs, the spillway crews, and the rail yard, and you get something close to an army, most of it unskilled, working within arm's reach of equipment that didn't forgive a missed step. Over the full 7 years of construction, accidents of every ordinary kind took their toll. Men drowned in borrow pits, men crushed under shifting timber, men caught in machinery that had no guardrails because nobody had thought to ask for them. Most of those deaths never made a newspaper outside Valley County. They simply became part of the cost of running a machine this size with men this replaceable. How long could a man last out there? 3 shifts a day, every day, in heat that hit 115 and cold that hit 54 below. One woman who grew up in the boom towns as a girl remembered waking up to find the water dipper frozen solid in its pail. The work didn't stop for weather because the dredging season was already short enough. Ice closed the river every winter, which meant every summer day not spent dredging was a day the whole schedule fell further behind. So the crews ran around the clock, through dust that coated a man's lungs by lunch and noise that never let up. Pumps, diesel engines blasting from the tunnels 3 miles off, the constant grind of draglines working the borrow pits. Residents in the camps got so used to the noise that they stopped hearing it until something changed pitch, and then everyone heard it at once. 11,000 men needed somewhere to sleep, eat, and spend a Saturday paycheck. And the government town of Fort Peck, built for engineers and men of responsibility, had room for only a fraction of them, so the rest built their own towns out of nothing. Wheeler went up fastest and rowdiest of all of them, a boom town of saloons, gambling tents, and dance halls thrown together on 2 muddy ruts that passed for streets. New Deal, Park Grove, Midway, Delano Heights, Macomb City. More than a dozen towns sprang up around the dam site inside of 2 years, full of tar paper shacks where the inside walls were sometimes papered, quite literally, with the dam's own discarded blueprints. Life magazine's reporters, touring the camps in 1936, noted with a wink that the only beds getting any rest in one of those towns were the ones already broken. It wasn't all vice. Families raised children in those towns. Parents and church groups scraped together money to build schoolhouses the federal government wouldn't fund because Washington had decided, wrongly, that the government school in Fort Peck Dam had room enough for everyone. It didn't. So Wheeler and Midway and Wilson built their own classrooms out of surplus Army buildings, while their fathers worked 3 shifts a few miles down the road and their mothers hauled wash water by hand because none of the boom towns had running water to speak of. The sudden population didn't just strain the schools. By the spring of 1935, the boomtowns had grown crowded and dirty enough that the Montana Board of Health stepped in, approving the area's first organized garbage routes, and Valley County passed an ordinance requiring outhouses and trash to be properly contained, a rule that wouldn't have been necessary anywhere that hadn't just absorbed thousands of new residents with no plumbing and no plan. The government tried to impose order in other ways, too. In the winter of 1935, officials ordered every single man on the project, and married men whose families hadn't yet arrived, out of the boomtowns and into government barracks at Fort Peck proper, on threat of losing their jobs. 2,000 workers signed a petition against it and sent it to Montana's own Senator Burton K. Wheeler, who pushed back hard enough in Washington that the order was rescinded within weeks. Proof that the men running the machines weren't willing to simply take whatever the project decided to hand them. What happened when 10,000 Depression refugees, a sudden flood of cash, and almost no law enforcement collided on the open prairie? Exactly what you'd expect. The boomtowns earned a reputation. Fistfights, bootleg whiskey, a sheriff in Wheeler who used to sell insurance in Atlantic City and was now the owner of the law for miles. The towns made headlines back east as a kind of frontier sideshow, wild and a little scandalous, the Depression's strange little carnival. The men who lived there mostly remembered it differently. Cold mornings with ice in the water pail, a job that paid when almost nothing else in the country did, and a paycheck that mattered more than the gossip. And underneath all of it, the noise, the saloons, the schoolhouses built from Army surplus, sat a quieter cost nobody put on a postcard. The rising reservoir would eventually drown more than 380,000 acres of river valley, swallowing homestead farms whose families had nowhere to go but a moving truck, and submerging traditional Assiniboine wintering grounds along the Missouri that had nothing to do with any blueprint. The dam gave 100,000 Depression-era families a paycheck. It took land from people who were never asked, and a river bottom that wasn't coming back. For 5 years, the machine ran, the towns grew, and the dam climbed toward its final height a few feet at a time. And then, in September of 1938, with the dam within 20 feet of its finished crest, closer to done than it had ever been, somebody on the morning inspection crew noticed a number that didn't look right. The day the ground walked away, the dam had already given a few warnings, small enough to shrug off at the time. During the diversion tunnel work, sections of the same Bear Paw shale had slumped without notice, more than once, burying tools and forcing crews to scramble clear. Nobody was hurt. The equipment was recovered, and the incident was logged and forgotten within a week. Engineers noted the slumps, attributed them to the bentonite seams everyone already knew were there, and kept building. Each time the ground had given a little, and each time it had stopped. That pattern, small movement, then stillness, became its own kind of false comfort. The slope had moved before and gone quiet. There was no obvious reason to expect anything different this time. The warning, when it came, was almost insultingly small. A pipeline running along the upstream slope was supposed to sit 4.5 feet above the core pool, the standing water inside the embankment's wet, unfinished interior. On the morning of September 22, 1938, the survey crew measured it at 30 inches. 2.5 feet, not 4.5. Somewhere underneath that stretch of dam, the fill was settling, sinking, and nobody yet knew why. It should have been the loudest alarm on the job site. Instead, it triggered a meeting. The district engineer scheduled a sit-down for 1:15 that afternoon, right at the spot in question, to discuss what the readings meant and what, if anything, needed to change. They never finished that conversation. I've gone back to the Corps' own report on this slide more than once, and the detail that never gets easier to sit with isn't the shale or the water pressure. It's that a meeting was scheduled for the exact minute the ground gave way. The men were already walking toward the spot where it happened, to talk about whether it might. At almost exactly 1:15 p.m., while engineers and supervisors were gathering at Station 15+10 to talk about a few inches of settlement, the ground beneath them started to move. Men working nearby would later struggle to describe the sound. Not an explosion, but a low, continuous groan, the prairie itself clearing its throat, rising up until it swallowed the ordinary roar of pumps and engines whole. The core pool began sinking faster. Cracks opened 30 feet below the crest, widening with a sound men felt in their chests before they heard it. And then the upstream shell of the dam, A slope of compacted sand and gravel that had taken years to build broke loose and started sliding into the reservoir, rotating, twisting south, dragging everything on top of it along for the ride. One construction supervisor happened to be driving away from the area at that exact moment. He glanced over and saw the crack in the embankment advancing west along the beach, keeping pace with his own car. He was doing roughly 10 miles an hour. So was the ground. He hit reverse and ran the engine flat out to outrun a landslide that was, by any normal measure, moving at a walking man's nightmare. Fast enough to outrun, but only if you were already in a car and already running. 134 men were working in that stretch of slope when it gave way. 34 of them were carried into the moving earth. Railroad track buckled and sank. Dredge pipelines folded like wet cardboard. A pump barge moored near the east abutment was swamped and lost, dragged under, along with tractors, loadmasters, and draglines that had been parked on the slope only minutes before. The same machines that had built the dam. Swallowed by the dam they built. In 10 minutes, more than 5 million cubic yards of material tore loose and slid into the lake. Sand, clay, steel, equipment, and men alike. The groan cutting off into a silence almost worse than the noise had been, forming a new island where there hadn't been one that morning. Would they get everyone out? Rescue crews worked through what was left of that day and into the night, pulling survivors from mud that had gone, for a few terrible minutes, almost liquid. 34 men were caught. 26 made it out alive. 8 did not. Their names deserve to be said plainly, because the dam has kept most of them anonymous for almost 90 years. Oliver Butcher, 58 years old, a laborer from Hinsdale, was the oldest man lost that day. Albert Stozer, 23, a deckhand from Glasgow, was one of the youngest. John Johnson, 25, ran a motorboat on the reservoir. Walter Lubbing, 29, worked as a drill runner's helper. Archie Mower, 26, was a deckhand like Stozer. Dolphy Paulson, 51, another laborer. Nelson Van Stone, 31, a foreman who'd likely been overseeing the very men working under him when the ground opened, and Douglas Moore, 35, an associate superintendent, one of the men whose job it was to read the warning signs in the first place. Only 2 bodies were ever recovered, Moore's and Stozer's. The other 6 are still inside the dam. Not metaphorically, physically. The Fort Peck Dam is to this day the resting place for 6 men nobody was ever able to dig out, sealed inside the very embankment their labor helped raise. The detail that makes the whole afternoon worse in hindsight is this. The engineers had already worried about this very stretch of slope failing, just not this way. As the fill climbed higher, they'd grown nervous enough about the narrowing beach along the upstream shell that they wired in an automatic alarm system, designed to shut the dredge pumps down the instant a breach looked likely. They'd built a warning system for the danger they could picture. The ground found a different one. The failure didn't start with the shell bursting outward. The scenario the alarm was built to catch. Boom. It started underneath. In shale, nobody's instruments were watching. In seams of clay quietly losing their grip on each other 1 degree of friction at a time. The safety system worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't watching the right place. What caused it? Engineers spent the next year testing, measuring, arguing. They ruled out an earthquake. There was no ground vibration recorded anywhere nearby. They ruled out the dam's core, far stronger than feared, dense enough that it slid into the lake largely intact rather than failing internally. What they kept coming back to was that same bentonite buried in the Bear Paw shale under the right abutment that nobody had been able to test under real-world conditions back in 1933. Years of fill piling on top of it had built up enormous water pressure in the shale, with nowhere to escape because the rock around it was almost watertight. That trapped pressure squeezed the strength right out of the bentonite seams until they were sliding past each other on almost nothing. Engineers later calculated a friction angle of barely 4 degrees, almost none at all. The slope hadn't failed because the engineers were careless. It failed because the ground itself had a weakness baked into it millions of years before anyone broke ground on a New Deal dam, and the only way to find that weakness was to load it until it gave. Newspapers across the country picked the story up within a day, running it alongside photographs of the new island sitting where solid ground had been that morning. A flagship New Deal project, the president's own showpiece for putting Americans back to work, swallowing 8 of those Americans whole. The political pressure was immediate, and an expanded board of consultants was brought in, not just to fix the slope, but to answer, publicly, whether the entire hydraulic fill method was safe enough to keep funding. Their findings reshaped how engineers across the country evaluated foundation strength under earthen dams for decades afterward. The dead were buried, 2 of them in actual graves, 6 of them inside the dam itself, and the project came to a dead stop. Construction halted for a full year while the board tore the design apart and rebuilt it. A flatter, broader slope where the failure happened. More steel sheet piling driven deep into the foundation. A wider berm to spread the load the bentonite couldn't carry on its own. The machine that had nearly killed itself came back stronger. But the question that mattered to the men still working there never really went away. If the ground could move like that once, with no warning beyond a few inches on a survey sheet, what was stopping it from happening again? It never did. Not at Fort Peck. But the dam had made its point. It hadn't just been built by men. For 10 brutal minutes in 1938, it had decided, on its own terms, who got to walk away. Word reached the boom towns before the dust on the slope had even settled. Wheeler went quiet that night. In a way, it almost never did. The saloons still open, but the noise gone out of them. Families who'd lost nobody still knew somebody who had, in a workforce that size, packed into towns that small. By the next morning, most of the men were back at their stations anyway, because the alternative was no paycheck at all, and the depression hadn't loosened its grip just because the ground had moved. What the dam remembers. They went back to work. The part of this story that usually gets lost next to the drama of the slide is what happened after. That after 8 men died, after a year of redesign, after every newspaper in the country ran the story of the dam that swallowed its builders, the project simply continued. Construction resumed. The dredges went back into the borrow pits. The remaining boomtowns kept selling beer and raising kids 3 miles from a slope that had moved at 10 miles an hour the year before. By July of 1940, the last loads of fill went into place, and the dam was officially dedicated on the 4th of July that same year, though the final topping out work wasn't finished until that October. 7 years, 11,000 men at the peak, 60 lives lost across the whole project. Most to ordinary construction accidents. 8 in a single afternoon nobody could have engineered around. When it generated its first electricity in 1943, Fort Peck Dam had already been the largest dam of any kind on Earth, a record it would hold for more than 3 decades. What did all of that earth and all of those lives buy? A flood control wall on a river that had drowned farmland for a century. A reservoir, Fort Peck Lake, that today ranks among the largest reservoirs in the country, with more shoreline than the entire coast of California. A power station that still runs, generating electricity for the region 8 decades later, operated now by a crew you could count on 2 hands, where 11,000 men once worked 3 shifts around the clock. The dam also gave barge traffic downstream a dependable channel for the first time in the river's history, one of the quieter purposes it was built for, and one of the few nobody had to die proving. 5 more mainstem dams went up on the Missouri downriver in the decades that followed, every one of them designed by engineers who'd studied what went wrong at Fort Peck and built accordingly. Today, the lake draws fishermen, boaters, and hunters from across the region, worth millions a year to a part of Montana with little else to draw on. The boomtowns are mostly gone. Wheeler, the rowdiest of them all, sits nearly empty now, its beer sign storefronts photographed more often by historians than visited by anyone living there. The homes families built out of tar paper and surplus army lumber were mostly hauled off to farms across Montana once the work ran out, leaving the camps that don't exist anymore as quietly as they'd appeared. The dam itself still stands right where they put it, holding back precisely what it was built to hold back. The slide of 1938, long since rebuilt and reinforced into the strongest stretch of the whole embankment. A memorial overlooks the dam today, naming the men lost in 1938 and the others lost across the whole job. A quiet acknowledgement, finally, of a cost the project rarely advertised at the time. And buried somewhere under that memorial sightline, inside roughly half a mile of compacted earth, 6 men are still there. Not symbolically. 6 bodies, never recovered, sealed permanently into the largest pile of dirt the country had ever built. There's a photograph that still gets reprinted more than any other image connected to this dam. Margaret Bourke-White's shot of the spillway towers. 2 workers dwarfed at the base of concrete piers climbing toward the sky. The picture that launched the very first cover of Life magazine. Decades later, the federal government put that same photograph on a postage stamp. A small square of American iconography stamped onto envelopes by people who likely never heard the word bentonite in their lives. Most people look at that image today and see triumph, American engineering at its grandest, the machine age made monumental. I think about it differently every time I see it reprinted somewhere new. Because what isn't in frame is the slope, 3 miles west, where the ground once moved faster than a man could outrun on foot, and where 6 of the builders never left. That, in the end, is the whole story of Fort Peck. Not just a dam, and not just a disaster, both woven through each other so tightly you can't tell where the triumph ends and the cost begins. The machines were never the danger by themselves. Neither was the river. The danger was always the ground underneath both of them, quietly deciding on its own schedule how much weight it was willing to carry. Think about what that means for a story this size. Every other antagonist in this kind of history announces itself. A flood, a storm, a machine breaking down loud enough for everyone in earshot to know something's wrong. The ground at Fort Peck did none of that. It sat under 11,000 men and 4 dredges and 125 million cubic yards of fill for 5 quiet years, giving away nothing until the one afternoon it gave away everything at once. They don't build them that there anymore. Not with 11,000 men and 4 dredges and a shipyard 1,000 miles from any ocean. Progress, out on that stretch of Montana prairie, came with a price tag nobody could see until the ground stood up and showed them. They paid it. The dam is still standing because they did,